Good morning. I'm just wanted
Good
to
morning,
check that
everyone.
can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.
Yes, very clear.
Don't worry, ah.
Okay, I will start the station. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for registering and joining us today for this webinar on what expected of you practicing research integrity in higher degree research. We are also grateful here to have Miss Ryah Perkiss with us as our speaker today. How are you, Miss?
I'm good, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Miss, for taking time to share your expertise. Without further ado, I will pass the virtual mic to Miss Ryah Perkiss to get us started. Miss Ryah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just first of all say thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. This is the first time I've been able to speak to any of our colleagues and fellow student researchers in Malaysia. And thank you to Dr. Jasmine Fan, who has been amazing over the last 6 months with making this connection for me. I have some slides to share, so I'm just going to get that up, and I'd like just confirmation that you can see those okay. Okay, is that sharing okay?
Yes.
Yes, that's okay. Great, thank you. Okie dokie. Okay, so as I've mentioned just in the chat, my name's Ryah Perkiss. I'm the Research Integrity Officer here at UOW. I've been working at UOW for just over 10 years. I've spent time in the graduate research school, so I have quite a good understanding of HDR processes. And I've also been working then in research integrity for 4.5 years. So it's still feel like there's a lot to learn. There's, it's very difficult to become an expert, I'd say, in research integrity. It's a very broad area. And in saying that, I want to make sure that when you leave today, you don't feel that you need to know it all. I think at the end of this session, what you'll find is there's a list of resources and different links that I'm providing throughout this session, and these slides will get distributed to you, and that those links over time, you might like to spend some time in some of the different resources that I'm suggesting that you have a read of. But hopefully today gives you a really good understanding of the introduction to research integrity, understand a little bit about what it is, and get to know myself a little bit better, what I do, and also a little bit about how you could actually practice research integrity in HDR, whether you're a researcher who is supervising students or whether you're a HDR candidate that's here today. So where I am today is in Wollongong. I'm presenting here from Wollongong, and I'm on Dharawal country. I'd like to just, express that my gratitude for the opportunity that I've got today to share this information with you, and just to also encourage you to tell me a little bit about yourself in the chat. Just how far through your degree are you? What discipline does your research fall under? And perhaps you could describe yourself as a student researcher in one word or one phrase. Totally up to you, not compulsory, not a requirement. It does just give me a little bit more information and insight into who I'm speaking to and that kind of thing. Now, I'm not going to be monitoring the chat. If there is something that you'd like to ask more about during the session, I'm happy for you to interrupt the session. Or if you do put something in the chat, I'm happy for somebody else to speak up on your behalf. Okay. Get moving. Today's session. So a little bit of an outline of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to try and really leave you today with a feeling of what is research integrity, because it's kind of somewhat of a difficult concept to go. I'm also going to talk through the different codes for research integrity. We're going to go on a little bit of a history lesson there, the framework and the principles, the responsibilities that you have, leave you with some really practical ideas of how you can practice research integrity, and also what to do when things go wrong. Like explain when things go wrong, what does that look like? There's a little bit of an exercise that we have. It's anonymous exercise where we can test your knowledge. There's about 10 questions involved in that. That's you self-testing. So you would only you would see your results. And there is a nice little summary at the end, which is a checklist of ideas for your next step in terms of your learning about research integrity. So what is research integrity? That's what it brings us to next. So if nothing else, I'd like to leave you today with the message that research integrity is not the same as human ethics or research ethics. It's also not the same as academic integrity. So now, like a number of you are entering into research space for the first time. So it's really important to understand those differences. So when we're talking about academic integrity, often we're talking about academic misconduct. So misconduct involves getting or giving help with assessments or presenting someone else's work as your own. It's basically sort of a form of cheating to pass a subject or to get a better grade in a subject. It could involve collusion or buying past papers, fraud or fabrication of information, or just even obstructing the work of other students. So it is a serious matter, and the consequences for academic misconduct could involve like a warning letter, a penalty with your mark, or you may fail the subject, for example. So the impact of academic misconduct is really on you as a single person. With ethics, we're talking about that national statement on ethical conduct in human research. There's other statements around, but we're talking about applying the principles of ethical research when it involves humans. So that's what ethics is really about. We're talking about the values of like research, merit and justice, beneficence and respect in carrying out human research. And it's usually overseen by a committee. So a committee will look at an ethics application and assess whether the values of human ethics are going to be met based on the design of your research project, and that there's a minimal risk and burden to the humans that are involved in that. So it's carried out, the review is ultimately carried out by an ethics committee. The impact can actually be on both you as an individual, but there can be a wider impact, and that wider impact could be on the humans or the animals or the environment for the research. So there's the impact starts to be bigger than academic integrity impacts if there is a breach of ethics. So with research integrity, it's a broader set of principles and then responsibilities that guide the right way to conduct research. And it's all aspects of research. It's not just human research or research involving humans. It's research involving all kinds of disciplines, and it involves every part of the research journey. So when you're undertaking research as a first-time researcher or supervising a first-time researcher, it's really important that you understand all those new considerations that apply to research. So that's where those differences kind of come in. So now in Australia, and as an Australian institution, the framework that we work under is the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. Now, if we think then about that academic misconduct being the impact being on the individual student, ethics, it's potentially on the individual researcher, but could have impact on humans, or if it's animal research, could have impact on animals or potentially the environment. When we're talking about research integrity, we start to talk about even broader. It's the community in general. Like it can be impactful on a global scale. say your research is in some kind of particular, like say an engineering piece of research where you're designing metal for bridges or something like that, it can impact on how that bridge is constructed, and then the people that drive over that bridge, but the environment, and it can impact on those who funded that research as well. So the responsibility is still on the individual researcher, but the impact starts to become a lot broader. And it's really important then that we make sure that we carry out our research in the best possible way and following all the principles and the responsibilities that come with research to make sure that we maintain that trust from the global community, that trust in research outcomes, so that they continue to respect research, support research, and also that funders come in and continue to support research in the future. So in terms of what is research integrity, like an actual definition, we actually still do not have a worldwide definition for research integrity. So we've got a few here that I'll just have a little refer to. So one of the ones that is very widely used is one by Stanley Corenman, and it's an active adherence to the ethical principles and professional standards essential for responsible practice of research. So it's talking about ethical principles, but also professional standards. So within any discipline, there are usually standards for the way research is carried out. It refers to all of the factors that underpin good research practice and promote trust and confidence in the research process. And that's from the United Kingdom Research Integrity Office. So we actually have a definition in UAW's Code of Practice, and we call research integrity a broad set of principles and responsibilities that characterise an honest, ethical, and conscientious research culture and provides the foundation for high-quality research, credibility, and community trust in that research endeavour. So that's ours at UAW. I think ultimately what we take away from this, and there's many more definitions out there, but what we take away is we can see that there's some key themes in there. We're talking about honest, we're talking about ethical, and we're talking about responsible. So we're talking about doing things the right way. But then what is that right way? What we really want to know is, what is that right way? So that's where these codes come in. So there are various codes across the world. I'm going to focus today, I'm going to provide a little history, and then I'm going to talk about the Malaysia Code and the Australian Code. So a little bit of a history of research integrity. It actually is quite young, much younger than human ethics, but one of the first public misconduct issues occurred in the US and in the 1980s. And there was actually 4 big cases across some 4 quite prominent universities in the US in the 1980s and probably very late 70s and the 80s. And they just established an Office of Scientific Integrity. And that's where really research integrity has its roots, in that office that was originally established. Mostly at this point, they were focused on addressing misconduct, so addressing these problems. So then across the 90s, they started to want to be a little bit more consistent with definitions of what misconduct was and what was the right thing to do. How should research be carried out? So they started to formalise policies and definitions around research integrity, and they created a centralised office in the US in 1993. So in 1997, things started to happen in Australia, and the NHMRC, which is our National Health and Medical Research Council, created some guidelines on research practice, like what's good practice. for research integrity. Lots of things were happening in other places in the world in that late 90s and early 2000s. And the European Scientific Federation, I think it's called, had the good scientific practice in research and scholarship in the early 2000s. Then the UK established its Office of Research Integrity in 2006. And then they started having world conferences in research integrity, where people were coming together from across the globe to discuss research integrity issues and holding conferences to discuss how are we going to address research integrity at a global level. Around that time of that first conference, Australia released its first code for the responsible conduct of research. That was 2007. There was a Singapore statement out of the World Conferences of Research Integrity in 2010. It's called the Singapore Statement because they met in Singapore. There was then Europe really came on board with a code of conduct for research integrity in 2011. The World Conference in Research Integrity developed a Montreal Statement in 2013. It was a lot about doing collaborative research and how people should be working together. Malaysia Code of Responsible Conduct of Research was the first edition was released in 2017. The second edition was released in 2021. The second edition of the Australian Code came out in 2018, and that's still in existence today, and that's what I'll be referring to a lot today. And then you had you've had a number of others. This is not everything that's happened, but it sort of gives you a bit of an idea of how long research integrity has been around, and the fact that different regions and countries have sort of developed their own codes off the back of these original issues that happened in the US. Now, what also happened was it moved from a status of how to address misconduct. It moved into more of a situation of how can we prevent misconduct, and the way that most regions and at these world conferences of research integrity, the way that they looked at it is what are the right ways to practice research or practice responsible research from the beginning in order to prevent misconduct. So that's where a lot of these codes, what you'll find embedded in a lot of these codes. So now if I talk about the Malaysia Code of Responsible Conduct of Research, it has 8 principles and it also has 17 good research practices. It's a very lovely, well-written document. It's probably about 12, 15 pages of to read through. But it has these 8 guiding principles: honesty, reliability, and so the research should be reliable. It should be objective. It should have impartiality and independence. It should have openness and be accessible. There should be a duty of care to participants. And there should be fairness in the way that we reference and give credit. And finally, that scientists and researchers should take responsibility for the future of research. So I'm going to show you now the Australian Code, and it also has 8 principles. That just happens to be a coincidence. And then I'm going to show you how the 2 of those codes, where they overlap. So with the Australian Code, we also have a principle of honesty, rigour. We talk about which rigour, very close to reliability, transparency, fairness, respect, the recognition principle, accountability, and promotion. So very similar, it has these 8 principles. Rather than those 17 good research practices that are spelt out in the Malaysian Code, the Australian Code has these 29 responsibilities. Now, not all 29 are for researchers. 13 are actually responsibilities of institutions, and 16 apply to individual researchers or supervisors. Then we also have 8 supporting guidelines that contain a lot more information about how to implement these 8 principles and 29 responsibilities. So those 8 supporting guidelines are a lot more pragmatic, a lot more practical advice. So now if I just have a look, now this is my interpretation. So I didn't get this from anywhere, but when I look at the detail, I feel that the honesty principle in the Malaysian code and the honesty principle in the Australian code are they're pretty much matched. Similar, the reliability and performing research principle in the Malaysia code very much aligns with the rigor principle in the Australian code. The 2 principles in the Malaysia Code around objectivity and impartiality and independence really are described in the Australian Code's transparency principle. There's the openness and accessibility principle in the Malaysia Code, as well as number 7, the fairness in providing references and giving credit. Now, those are both quite well covered in the fairness principle in the Australian Code. The duty of care code, which really talks about ethics and human ethics and animal ethics, is very well reflected in our respect code. And finally, the responsibility for scientists and researchers of the future is very much about the promotion code. Now, there's two principles in the Australian code. One is accountability and one is recognition. I am going to talk about these in a little bit more detail, but those two I found they're there. The accountability principle is woven into a lot of this and actually comes out a lot more in the good practice guide. And then the recognition principle is quite unique to Australia and Australian code. But what I'd really like you to take away from this is, because I'm going to be teaching you and referencing a lot about the Australian code, I want to make sure that you understand that ultimately it really doesn't matter which set of principles you follow, as long as you're following these general principles, because the themes are all the same. The themes are all about that honest, ethical and responsible research. So whilst I'm going to talk in detail about the Australian code for the rest of this session, it really doesn't matter. As a researcher in Malaysia, there is requirements for you to follow the Malaysia Code for legislative reasons and that kind of thing. I understand that. But then as a researcher for UOW, which is an Australian institution, you also have to follow the Australian code. But I wanted to show that these two codes, and they're actually very well aligned. They're very well matched up. So don't feel that you're having to follow 2 codes. You're actually following a very similar set of principles. So I've mentioned already that there's these 8 principles, these 29 responsibilities, and these 8 supporting guidelines. And these are all reflected in our UOW policy suite. I'm going to talk about that policy suite as well today. It applies to all research activity from the time you start planning or thinking about a piece of research, all the way through to submitting your research or a research output, like a publication to a journal, and actually beyond that. So for the rest of time. But all research activity conducted at Australian institutions, including our offshore campuses, does need to be carried out in alignment with the Australian code. So we have responsibilities at UOW as an Australian institution with our regulator, which is called TEXA. We need to make sure that we can report to TEXA to say that our research is being carried out with research integrity and as per the Australian code. As I mentioned, the Australian code does have in those 29 responsibilities for us as an institution as well as for individuals, and our regulator asks us to report on both of those and report against those responsibilities. So the framework for research integrity at UOW. So this Australian code So there's a little picture of the document, and this is a hot link in here that will take you to it. This document is actually only about 4 pages of reading, so not very long at all. It's quite to the point, and it's a very quick, I guess, overview and summary of research integrity. It's also got 8 principles that I mentioned. Sorry, the 8 principles and the 29 responsibilities are all listed in here. And then there's those other guidelines that are there in the background that go into a lot more detail. Now, this document is then used by us as an institution, and we create our policy document for research at UAW. And our overarching policy document for research integrity at UAW is called the Code of Practice, Responsible Conduct of Research. So this applies to all research carried out at UAW. So we use that Australian code as a guide, and you will see very similar terms and words and things used within our policy document, but that's our overarching policy. So if we then take a look, that's our overarching policy. Then there's a supporting guideline in the Australian Code for data information, so for data management. Likewise, UAW then has a research data management policy. So, and you'll see that the key themes are reflected in that policy. There's also an authorship guideline, and we at UAW have an authorship policy that reflects those requirements that are outlined in the Australian Government's authorship guideline. There is a supervision guideline that is written by the the Universities Australia, and at UAW we have a higher degree research HDR supervision and resources policy document. We have a conflict of interest policy at UAW, and it doesn't only reflect the disclosure of interests and management of conflicts of interest document that's provided in the Australian Code. It reflects other things to do with conflicts of interest, but it is a reflection of that. And there is a guide to managing and investigating potential breaches or research misconduct. And likewise at UAW, we have a matching policy that supports this. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about these 8 principles and what they are. What do they mean? So just a little bit of a recap. Research integrity, what it really does is it just provides guidance on how to navigate research responsibly. What does that mean? What does researching responsibility mean? So it provides really a set of expectations for us to work within. And these expectations underpin good research practice and promote trust and confidence in the research process. So that trust and confidence is what we want everybody outside research to have in us, but also our fellow researchers. So as a student, you want your supervisor to be able to trust your work. As a supervisor, you want to be able to trust the work of your students, that they're undertaking research with integrity. It also provides an opportunity for us to improve the quality of research in the processes and the methodologies that are undertaken, and also to make sure that those final outputs are a good quality, that what's going out there into the world are a good quality. So if we just start with honesty, and I'm going to go through some practical examples of all of this as well. But honesty, it's a nice, simple one. It really comes down to truth and accuracy. So that's truth and accuracy in the developing, undertaking, and reporting of research. Always honesty. Information should always be presented truthfully and accurately. Rigor is next. And this is where we talk about having attention to detail, making sure that anything you're developing, your reporting, your undertaking of research, it's always underpinned with attention to detail, and that there's a robust methodology in place. and that there's also strategies in place to avoid or acknowledge any biases that may be in the collection of data, qualitative or quantitative data, that there is processes in place to acknowledge that. Transparency is where we start to talk about declaring our interests, making sure that we're very transparent with any conflicts we may have, and also that we share openly. We need to make sure that we manage our interests. Like, conflicts of interests are not taboo. They can exist, and research can be carried out with them, but it's really important that we manage them, and we manage our reputation in that way. And then also we want to be able to share and openly communicate not only our outputs, but our methodology and our findings and our knowledge. Potentially our data, as long as it's not human data or sensitive in any way, potentially our data as well. Fairness is really about how we work with others and how we treat others. So we must treat our fellow researchers with respect, and that's what that fairness principle is all about. It's about making sure that we reference appropriately, including self-referencing, that we cite appropriately, that we don't use the work of others, but also when we're looking at collaborating with people on a paper, that we apply really fair authorship practices and that we give appropriate credit to people who have contributed to the work. And we also don't give credit to people who have not contributed to the work. Respect is the next principle that I'd like to touch on. Respect is where your ethics really comes in. This is where we need to make sure we're treating all humans, animals, communities, and the environment with care and respect. And that's what the respect principle is all about. Recognition principle is, as I mentioned, it's very unique to Australia. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in a second, but it's ultimately we need to acknowledge and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's continual connection to country and make sure that we engage them in the process of research. Accountability. Now, this is the principle that I said didn't stand out in the Malaysia Code, but it was woven amongst a lot of the other principles. So the accountability principle is really making sure that research complies with all legislation, any policies, any guidelines, and any other discipline-specific standards that might be in place, and that we also use our resources wisely. So if you're working in a lab, like, be respectful of that lab. Make sure you understand that that lab, there is a cost behind that. So make sure we use those resources. Or if your research is funded, make sure that you're using those resources as you said that you would. But also, even if you're just using your supervisor's time, that is a resource that is being provided to you. Yes, you are paying fees to be at a university, but your supervisor's knowledge and experience is really valuable, and we need to make sure that we are accountable for how we use that. Finally, we talk about accountability being you holding responsibility for the consequences and the outcomes of research before it's communicated. So we need to really think through, how is this piece of research going to be received, and be responsible for that. Consider those consequences. Consider what groups might be impacted. Finally, promotion is probably the one that I'll talk about the least, but promotion today is a classic example of promotion. Jasmine has invited me here today to talk about research integrity. So promotion is all about fostering a responsible culture for research and making sure we all know what the right thing to do is and that we keep talking about it. As a supervisor, if you're a supervisor on the call today, purely by supervising and talking about research integrity with your students, you are promoting research integrity and you're carrying out this principle. So it's really important that we make sure that our junior researchers are mentored and supervised appropriately and according to the code. So now I'm going to just give a little bit of an example of each of these in practice. As I mentioned, we've got honesty. So honesty in practice. So how can you put honesty in practice? This is just a short example. So this graph that I've got displayed on the screen at the moment, you can see this has been taken from a presentation that I received. Just you can see quite quickly, like it's quite a complicated graph. There's quite a bit going on here, but we can talk quite quickly about what is good about this graph. So I think it's very, very clear what's being reported through the header. The header is quite clear, putting honesty into practice, an example. So proportion of workers paid or close to NMW that are underpaid on the left axis and BITE on the right axis. There's a very clear heading. So this is a good thing, having a clear heading on any graphs. There's a clear labelling on each axis, down the left, down the right, and across the bottom, and then there's some different references throughout the graph. The data source is noted. If you look down the bottom, they've actually shown that they've noted where they've got their data sources from, which means that this information is replicable. The methods used are also noted, and it's shown that they actually got the data from different data sources, and this is shown in different colours across the graph. That's shown that there's different methods were used to collect the data at different stages. Now, the other thing that is really clear is that the years 21, 22, 23, 24, 25 are actually only a prediction. It doesn't sort of show another bar underneath, and those circles are clear rather than solid. So it's very clear that it's a prediction. So even without understanding what this graph is really about, you can really start to see that it's very honest. The researchers being very honest. They're not hiding anything. There's no ambiguity. So the other way to avoid any ambiguity is just to show it to somebody else and see if they can understand it. So rather than because when you're very close to your own work, you understand it so well that sometimes you can't pick out the ambiguity yourself. So having somebody else look at your graph can actually help you be honest. Okay. Now, you're welcome to put any ideas in the chat of how you think this could be improved, but I'm going to just talk through a couple. So the first thing that appears to me is there is this acronym used in the header called NMW. I think that the first time that that's written, it should be spelt out. What is NMW? So that is one way that it could be more honest, I guess, is to make sure that that's very clear. The scale on the left-hand side goes from 0 to 70%, but the scale on the right-hand side goes from 35% to 70%. So maybe it may end up that it's slightly different and it may be skewing the view of the data. I can't say that for sure, but it may be. So that would be something I'd suggest might contribute to not honesty, but just not being 100%, I guess, transparent or viewing it 100% well. I haven't got anything else that I'd like to suggest for this one, but I think it's a nice example that we can use to show how you can put honesty into practice. If you have any other ideas, feel free to include them in the chat. Next is rigor, and if you remember, this is about the attention to detail and a robust methodology. So what strategies can you use for this? So just an example, a question that you may use in a survey is, what is your current employment status? So if you're asking this, I've seen this question used before in different things, maybe not in an actual research, but what is your current employment status? So, and the options might be employed, self-employed, student, unemployed, retired, or not working. And what could be missing from that list that could end up meaning that your data ends up either biased or skewed? So there's things that are missing from that list that could be, it could be that you are actually employed, but you're off sick. You could be employed and you could be having a baby, for example. You could be employed but not working for some other reason. So if it was a single option that you gave people, some people may answer that question in different ways. So it's really important to consider the options that are provided in a survey. So that's a sort of a nice simple example to look at. Once again, one of the ways that you can have a look at or make sure that your surveys are carried out with rigor is to really have somebody else fill it out, or have a pilot where you have people check it, or you see what their responses they're giving. Another way of using this or checking for rigor in your survey is to actually use an AI tool. This is one of the really good ways of using AI, is to use an AI tool to actually test out your question. Ask it to be a respondent to a survey. Say, this is the question and these are the options. Then ask it how you could improve. How could you improve that question? So it's a really good way of using AI in your research. So when designing your surveys, this is an example of rigor, putting rigor in practice. When designing them, just really consider thoroughly what you actually want to know and how a user may respond to that question, and whether there's any way that bias could be introduced or inaccuracies and skewed data may be introduced by people answering it in a different way. Also seek advice from survey design experts. I'm sure your supervisor may be a survey design expert. Otherwise, there's usually some at UOW as well. There are particular people that work in this space. And review other published surveys. There's actually templates available. Think about your sample size and the weighting that you would give to different samples, and make sure that you, in terms of rigor, if you can, you publish your underlying data, because that just means you're much more open and it gives much more opportunity to find issues with your data. Transparency, just a reminder, transparency is a lot about your conflicts of interest. So putting it in practice, talking about any conflicts of interest that may impact on your research, and declare those. Make sure any methods that you're going to use are documented, any assumptions are documented, any possible sources of bias in your data you're aware of those and you list them. Your research is all verified, that it can be replicated, that your results are reported in full all the time. We don't cut out outliers because it makes our outputs look better. And any underlying data is published if appropriate. And finally, you must cite your own work. So if any of you are PhD students who have also have completed a master's and your PhD is carrying on from that, if you are quoting anything or using any materials from your master's that as a reference, you need to make sure you're citing that work. You need to make sure that you're transparent about citing your own work. Fairness. So being fair to fellow researchers, really simple, just being a good human being. So citing the research of others accurately, never claiming someone else's results, not excluding people who have contributed, and not including other people who have not contributed. That includes authors, acknowledgements, and also secondary research opportunities. Research is for everyone. So we need to make sure that we are inclusive and we're open and we're operating as a team. And really, ultimately, you need to do what you say you will do in terms of being a fair fellow researcher. Respect. if anybody is doing qualitative research involving humans, really simple, you must have ethics approval before you start. That is how you put the respect principle in practice. You must be very clear and open with participants about what you're doing, what's the purpose of the research. And you must make sure that you get their consent and keep a record of that consent. Be really sensitive to their needs, and then make sure that you're protecting any data that they provide you. Be also aware of restrictions with the use of Gen AI tools. I know I've mentioned using Gen AI tools to test out your survey, but we need to be really careful with using Gen AI tools in terms of if you're doing research that involves an ethics application, you really should be careful about what transcription services you use, and also whether you use any tools. You cannot upload sensitive data or data that does not belong to you, as in private data, into a Gen AI tool. And finally, there are legislative requirements for storing that data and also for disposing of that data, and you need to make sure that you see those through. Now, this principle, the recognition principle, is actually quite unique to the Australian Code, as I mentioned, and it calls for all research that involves Indigenous Australians, whether that's people, communities, culture, knowledge, creative works, or country. It calls for it to be carried out in a collaborative and meaningful and beneficial way. So historically, this really reflects that. Historically, some research, not all research, but some research that has been conducted about Indigenous peoples in Australia has not been undertaken in a respectful way. And we're trying to reverse that. And this principle is there to remind us and recognise the past and make sure that we change the way we conduct research going forward. So I feel that the spirit in which it's written can apply to research conducted in any part of the globe that involves Indigenous peoples, but primarily this principle is about research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So some examples of how you can be accountable. So if you are undertaking human research, just be across the requirements of the national statement or the requirements for conducting human research in Malaysia. Be across any privacy legislation associated with your work. If your research is funded, make sure that the way that you said you were going to use the money that your funder has provided, that's the way you use it. That's how you remain accountable. And it also, a lot of funders require you to publish open access. So you need to make sure that you adhere to that. So really make sure to be accountable for funding. You really need to make sure you know all the requirements of your funder. Have a look at that agreement and make sure you understand it in detail. Accountability in publishing, make sure you use official channels. We don't mention anything about our research in social media. You don't sort of, what would be a good way of saying it? Like provide hints or tips or quick information through social media before you've actually put an official research output out there. Only once the research is verified do we ever, like through either peer review or examination, through the examination process of a thesis, or through peer review through a journal. Once we do that and it's verified, that's where we can publish research and we can start talking about it. And also, I've mentioned here predatory publishers. This is a topic within itself, but know how to spot a predatory publisher. So there are publishers out there that are not legitimate, and it's really important to be aware of that. That's a hot link there to where you can find out more information about that. And really be understanding of misinformation and disinformation. It's really important to not mislead and whether that's intentional or not, it's really important to not mislead with information. And promotion, I've mentioned, it's purely about even attending today, making sure we're aware, making sure we continue to talk about research integrity makes us accountable. Now, why does any of this matter? Have a think about that, just little reflection. Why do you think it matters? And feel free to add into the chat any ideas you might have on why it matters. I'm about to talk about it, but feel free to add into the chat some ideas. Why do you think it matters? Why does any of this carrying out research responsibly, why would it matter? It's going to give you a few seconds to have a think about that and add in your comments. I can't see them at the moment, but if you would like to add them in. Right. So why does this matter? So I've broken this up into 3 different categories. Now, first of all, let's just address what's on the left of this screen. So they're a little bit older, but these are actual extracts from newspapers where different pieces of research have been found to have misconduct and there's been issues. So a cancer drug trial suspended, millions of dollars in research money frozen, $10 million settlement over research misconduct to do with heart stem cells, fake science, taxpayers shelling out money for unreliable research, and a University of Queensland researcher, which is quite a famous one, facing court on fraud and dishonesty charges. And that one was related to Parkinson's disease and receiving a lot of money to do research into Parkinson's disease over a number of years. So any of these newspaper articles damages the reputation of the individual researcher, the reputation of the institution, the reputation of the researchers that worked with that person, and sometimes the research discipline itself. So you see something that has happened to do with heart stem cells, you immediately start to question all research involving the heart. Like it's just a natural human thing. You start to question things. You start to lose trust. And then, so it impacts the discipline. So it's not just about that individual researcher, and that's what I was trying to stress at the beginning of this session today. So the responsibility of carrying out things with research integrity becomes bigger as you are starting to enter into research and going from doing, say, an undergraduate or a master's degree, you're into research now, and it's really important that we don't have this impact because it's bigger than you. It's bigger than you and your team. It's actually the research community and potentially like your discipline, but also it can impact, it actually could mean that there is bad research out there. And what ends up happening is other people pick up your bad research, not knowing that it's bad research, and they create their own research off it. And so that research gets damaged. So there's a few reasons. First of all, the formal reasons. Need to just follow standards, meet those high research standards. It's a requirement for funding, like you have to do it. There's criminal liabilities and there's national security to think about. So they're some of the main reasons. But we also have ethical reasons. It's just the right thing to do. It's the right thing to carry out research responsibly. And we do that for the greater community, for the global community, and we also do it for humans, for animals, and for our environment to make sure that we, as the world or as the global community, are improving things and not making things worse. So the final is the impact reasons, which is what I've just touched on. We really want quality outcomes, and we want research to be able to be trusted and reliable. We want it to be able to be replicated, and we want to continue to have a good reputation. So we want you to have a good reputation. We want your supervisor to have a good reputation. We want other researchers that you're working with in your discipline to have a good reputation. And we want UOW to have a good reputation for doing research. So really important to make sure that we're all working together and doing the right thing rather than the wrong thing. And the wrong thing can sometimes be accidental. It's not always on purpose, for example. But we ultimately want that high quality research, credibility and community trust in that research endeavour. That's why it matters. So I'm now going to get a little bit more specific into HDR. So of those 8 principles in the Australian Code, all of them apply to supervisory relationships, but if we really have a look, we want to make sure that you're aware that your supervisor and you actually have professional responsibilities that get spelt out in the code. So in other words, you don't get to make it up. But in fact, there are policies that outline how that supervisory collaboration should work and how you should work together, and what you need to contribute and what your supervisor needs to contribute. So if we do take a look at those 8 principles, yeah, they all apply, but I think the 3 that are most relevant is that fairness principle, which talks about how we work with others, the accountability principle, which asks us to adhere to legislation, policies and guidelines and make good use of resources, and that promotion principle, which is about fostering and maintaining a research culture that values an environment of mentoring and responsible conduct. And it really, it's about creating the researchers of the future. So there is a guide, as I mentioned. There's the supervision guide that spells out. This is one of the guides in Australia, but this is the supervisor guide for research integrity, and it spells out what is required of a supervisor. It includes institutional responsibilities, the individual supervisor responsibilities, and it also includes research student responsibilities. So all of our all of our policies around supervision at UOW are guided by that document. And there's a list there there's a link there, not a list. There's a link there to that HDR supervision and resources procedure, which outlines how we do supervision at UOW. In terms of, I'm just going to go now through, I'll go back one slide. So I mentioned that in this guide, there's institutional, supervisor and research student responsibilities. I'm now going to spend some time on each of these. So in terms of our institutional responsibilities, there's really, summarising it, it really comes down to 4 different responsibilities. So as an institution, which is sort of my job, but also the Graduate Research School's job, we need to make sure that anybody who becomes a supervisor has the skills, qualifications and resources to be a supervisor. We need to make sure that we provide ongoing training that promotes research integrity. That's what we're doing here today. We need to make sure that there are mechanisms in place that support healthy relationships, and we need to also have mechanisms to resolve disputes. So at UOW, we do this, okay? So this is how we do it. We make sure that anybody who is a supervisor has to be called, there's a definition for research active. They actually already are, or they are an experienced researcher. They have done this before. They're not just somebody who has never researched before. We provide a development program for our supervisors, and we provide them with training. There's also a supervisor registration process that we have. And there's a bunch of resources that are provided for HDR supervisors. And we have a procedure policy in place. We also have training and promotion. There's research integrity training available in Moodle anytime, anywhere. We have a number of HDR workshops held throughout the year, which I know, I think these are only just starting to come to Malaysia. Like, you're just starting to get information on this stuff. So we'll get there. We're not perfect yet, but we're going to get there. Today is one of those sessions. We have a research integrity website. I know I've been working with Jasmine to create some information off the UAW Malaysia website to point back to the main research integrity website. We have different avenues for support available, and we have training to make sure that everybody's on the same page. We also have dispute resolution processes. There's a number of procedures and policies that are around that we have to resolve disputes. So that's how UAW fulfills those institutional responsibilities. So now we'll talk a little bit about the responsibilities for supervisors and those under supervision. So supervisor responsibilities, I think this one's quite straightforward. They need to provide guidance and mentorship on responsible research conduct. So that's what's required. They need to monitor the conduct of those under supervision. So making sure that they're checking in and checking the work. They need to undertake and promote education and training in responsible research conduct. Establish and maintain an appropriate level of engagement. So with that, we're talking about face-to-face contact, meetings, making sure they're engaged and that kind of thing. And make sure that we acknowledge the work of others. So that is related to authorship, and I'm going to talk about that. So that's the sort of the 5, or a summary of the 5 research supervisor responsibilities. Now, those who are under supervision, so in other words, HDR candidates, but it can be others as well, but ultimately the HDR candidates. Your responsibilities. You need to demonstrate a professional attitude. You should be professional, almost like a PhD is a job, like you're in a workplace. You need to work cooperatively, complete any training and inductions that your supervisor is suggesting you attend, or that the university tells you you need to attend. So you need to take control for your own learning and development. You also need to play an active role in your own professional development. So not just your developing all your soft skills, but also developing as a researcher. So that's a summary of those. And now, how do you actually do this in practice? So I guess my first goal today was really to make sure that you and your supervisor understand that you don't get to make up the relationship, and that there's actually policies and guidance to say this is how you kind of need to have that collaboration work together. So now, I guess my goal now is to make sure, how do you take those requirements that I've just explained, how do you take those and make them work in practice to build an effective and collaborative relationship? So let's start by talking about contact. So this is often some of the relationships that fall down, and it's not always, but some of those relationships that fall down, it's often because there's not enough contact, okay? And what really should be happening is the commencement of candidature process, which happens usually in the first couple of months from when you start your PhD. So when you enroll as a PhD candidate, within those first couple of months, you would discuss and agree on contact. So that would be meetings. So it usually would be a written agreement of how often meetings will take place and where they will take place. Sometimes it may be online, it may be in person, and who should be there. So as a guide, and I stress that this is a guide, and this is from a document written by Professor Simon Moss, the Dean of Graduate Research School. It's around 42 hours of meeting time per year for a full-time PhD candidate. Now, when I say that 42 hours, I don't mean your primary supervisor. So if you had 3 supervisors, so a primary and 2 co-supervisors, so that would equate to 3 supervisors into 42 hours. It's about 13, 14 hours, and it's about one 1-hour meeting per month. Okay, it's around that. It can vary. It might be that at the beginning you need more contact, in the middle you need less contact, and at the end you need more contact. It might be different again. It might be at the beginning you're completely fine. In the middle, maybe it's you need a lot more help with your analysis, or maybe you need a lot more help with your write-up. That can vary across the time, but that's a bit of a guide and a bit of an average. That's what we're talking about. It's not you just meet once every 6 months. Once every 6 months, I would be concerned. It's really about regular and meaningful contact. The supervisor is there to provide oversight and guidance, checking what you're doing and making sure that you're on track, not just from a time perspective, but also from an integrity perspective. They're checking the methodology that you're following. They're checking the way that you're developing your survey. They're checking where you're storing your data and the data you're collecting. They're checking your analysis. So it's not just about how often you meet, it's actually about that being meaningful. Now, behind the scenes, your supervisor actually does a lot of work for you that you don't see. There's so much administration. There's often professional development that they're doing to help you. There's reviews, and there's all sorts of other things they do. So really, it's really important to understand that your supervisors are really busy people. They do have a lot of other responsibilities. Supervision is only one of those responsibilities. They often teach, and they often are doing their own research, and they have other students as well. So when you do have time with them, it's really important that you're on time, being professional, on time, and that you get the most out of that time with them, that you're respectful of that time. So also understand that your supervisor doesn't have to answer every single one of your questions. We are a university of thousands of people, like a couple of thousands, and there are other people and resources to help. So your supervisor, if you can't find it, your supervisor might be able to point you in the right direction, but there's also other people available to help you with things. So make sure that those questions don't all go to your supervisor. Sometimes there's other people that can help you instead with some of those more administrative questions and that kind of thing. Doesn't all have to be your supervisor. Now, if we talk a little bit about meetings, as a professional, I am recommending that you set up an agenda for any meeting you're having with your supervisor and you send it in advance, and that afterwards you take or you write up some notes from the meeting and that you circulate those to all your supervisory team, whether that's 1, 2, 3 supervisors, however many. Keeps everyone on the same page. Now, the reason that we do that is, first of all, it's a professional thing to do. Secondly, if there is anything, it keeps everybody on track, but also it identifies if there's anything that your supervisor might need to do to prepare for that meeting, to make sure that you have everything that you need and that you can get everything out of that meeting that you want to get. So we strongly suggest keeping a list of action items with a status, a list of questions that you think you want to discuss at that meeting, and how any issues you might be facing. Make sure there's any feedback. recorded, and also what you think might be accomplished before the next meeting. So that should be on the agenda. There can also be a section for administration, so any forms that you need to process, like if you're like your commencement of candidacy, your research proposal review, that kind of thing, any dates that might need to be set. You can also talk about your professional development, so any training you might need to attend or that might be good to include. And of course, any business or for the next meeting. There is a link there to a sample agenda template. I think that link is actually on my OneDrive, so you may not be able to access it, but I will circulate that sample agenda template and a sample minutes template when I send out the copy of the slides. So now just on that second half, you attend the meeting, you've been to the meeting, you've had this discussion with your supervisor or your supervisory team. It's really important then to follow up with some notes. Doesn't have to be pages and pages, just a really short summary of what was discussed and what's the outcome. Just show the progress on anything that was already in action, anything new that's come up, and any questions and issues and how they're going to be resolved, as well as a date and time for the next meeting. So the agenda sets you up for meeting success, but taking meeting notes sets you up for success in your project. We really also recommend this because it's a record. It's a record if things go wrong, but it's also a record of what's happened so that your supervisor can see what you're taking away from the meetings. It's just another way of communicating with each other to see if everyone is on the same page and make sure that everyone you keep the research on track. Some other things that you may want to discuss at the meeting is just looking at the progress against your project plan. You might want to talk about research data management. You might want to talk about publishing plans. You might want to talk about authorship, any permits you might need, or like if you need an ethics application. And of course, as I mentioned, you can also identify training opportunities. So those meeting notes really help avoid issues of miscommunication and keep everything on track. So we strongly recommend that. If we talk about authorship, I've got 2 slides on authorship. Authorship is a session in itself, and I could talk about authorship for sort of an hour. I'm not going to talk about authorship at that length, but I will mention 2 things for supervisors to know as well as for research students to know. There are 2 new clauses in the authorship policy suite for UOW. The first one is that students undertaking a HDR degree will typically, and the word is typically, be identified as the first author on any work arising from their thesis. Okay. You can get a variation to the principle. You need a strong justification, and we've said it needs to be approved by the Dean of Graduate Research, but it could be approved by the equivalent at UOW Malaysia. But you really need to ensure that the default is that a student is the first author on the work. A supervisor can certainly be listed if they've made an intellectual or scholarly contribution. Now, it's all based on the authorship criteria in the policy. So you need to be very aware of that and make sure that it's very understood. Now, if the supervisor has actually made the most significant intellectual or scholarly contribution and to the paper, then of course there may be a justification for the supervisor being a first author, but otherwise, if it is work arising from the student's thesis, they are typically the first author. Similarly, like this is one of probably the biggest areas of contention is authorship in research. And we also have this clause that's found in the authorship procedure, and that is that an agreement form or similar, something in written format, should be completed at the start of a project. So I would say for any supervisory relationship, if you have one, as soon as you start to know if there's you could probably have the discussion in the first 6 to 12 months. If you know there's going to be a paper out of that thesis, or even if it's earlier than that, if you know there's going to be a paper, you put an agreement in place up front so that's very clear who is going to be listed as an author on that paper and the order of that. Now, these authorship agreements can be living documents. They can change over time. They allow for changes, and there's a link there to go to the authorship forms so that you can have a look at what they look like. But they're a document that are there to help you have these discussions. So I encourage at your next, if you haven't already got an authorship agreement in place and you're further along than sort of 6 months into your thesis, I strongly encourage you to have a discussion in your next supervisory meeting. Research data management. So look, I think there's some things that still will need to happen in Malaysia to get research data management probably at the same, so up to a standard that is closer to the UAW research data management policy. There's stuff that has to happen here. It's not perfect, but we're getting there. We're making progress in this space. It's definitely not an area that we're perfect, and it's definitely not an area that I would say I would be really strong in saying we do this well. We're getting better. That's what I would say. It's really important, though, that we just recognise that while the research output gets put out into the world, the data behind that, it's a really valuable resource, and it needs to be managed, it needs to be considered, and it needs to be thought about throughout the entire life cycle, even before it exists. So we talk about, and if we have a look at that data life cycle on the left-hand side, we really start at that plan and design stage. And you'll see that from planning and designing your research, that's where you really start to think about what sort of data are you going to collect. So you're starting to think about it before you've collected it. After you've planned, then you go and collect it. Then you analyse it, you evaluate it, you disseminate and share it. Potentially, you even share your data openly, and then you've got the opportunity to reuse it. And then that may go into your next research project in the planning and design. Now, you can see as you go around that whole life cycle, in the center of that life cycle is the store and manage. That means throughout the life cycle, you're thinking about where that research data is and how you're managing access to it. So where are you storing it? Is it backed up? Most IMTS processes, or our IT processes at UAW, are backing it up. Who could access it? Are you protecting any sensitive data? And then also thinking beyond the project, particularly if you have human data, you're working with human data, but there are minimum retention times. And there are also times that you've told participants that you're going to dispose of the data. And it's really important that that all happens. Often, once a research output goes out, everyone forgets about the data. It's really important that it continues to be managed and looked after for the entire life cycle until it's disposed. And there's a number of reasons why we need to do this, but I think some of them are quite obvious and some less so. But again, we can do a whole session on research data management and how to manage data responsibly. Really important that we do have research data management training available. We have a variety of things available. We have some quite good web pages now that have come together to explain a little bit more about research data management, and I encourage you to have a look at that. It's really the planning stage and creating a research data management plan is really important part of that responsible conduct of research. Now, I don't think you do this in Malaysia yet. I'm not sure that you use Redbox. I'm not 100% sure, but at least under the UAW Research Data Management Policy, you do need to have an RDMP. It doesn't necessarily have to be in Redbox. We encourage it right now. We're encouraging it because it gives us an understanding of where our research data is. So it's historically, research data management plans were only required for projects involving human ethics. That is now a myth. It's required for planning research, is required for all research projects. So here in Wollongong and in Australia, we create an RDMP in Redbox. They also do it for our Dubai campus. That is only where the plan is stored. It's not where data is stored. So data is then still stored in various UAW storage platforms that are approved. Here in Australia, we use MS Teams for storage. We use a system called Storage Grid, and there is for like big data, there's this high processing area that we can use as well. So that's where all research data needs to be stored. I don't think we have that perfect yet, but that's what we're doing. I understand in Malaysia that right now there isn't that level of this is where we store stuff, but I think SharePoint is coming. From what Jasmine tells me, SharePoint is coming, so that is somewhere where you will eventually store data. In the meantime, you can still be thinking about these things. You can still be thinking about access. You can still be thinking about backing up. It's about not losing your data. It's about not giving access or it being exploited. So yeah, we can still do some work in this space. And yeah, planning, thinking in advance, thinking about where you're going to keep your data, who can access it, are they the right people to be able to access it? Funnily enough, we always say as well, it should never only be one person that has access to research data. So as a minimum, it would be you and supervisors. It's potentially others as well. Okay, knowledge and skill development. This was another area. So you should expect to complete all your induction training. So anything that you're required to do, you should be doing. Like any of those inductions that you get invited to, you should be going to those as a HDR candidate. Your supervisor highly likely will be sending you suggestions on readings and trainings to make sure that you have all the knowledge that you need to undertake your research. You should read those. You should make sure that you complete a rigorous review of the literature, particularly if your supervisor is making suggestions about other literature. You should make sure you review that. And understand your social responsibilities, okay? It's really important that you understand that your research will have an impact. If your supervisor is providing you suggestions for improvement or improvement of the credibility, you should take that on board. Be a little humble and take that information on board. You are being mentored. Your supervisor may also ask to see different parts of your research or ask you questions. That's their job. Their job is to make sure that your research is original, that it is being carried out with rigor, and they're expected to do that. And you should expect to have your work checked. That is just part of that collaboration process. Your supervisor will provide you guidance if there's an application process or a permit or anything like that required. And if there is any training recommended, including research integrity training like today, you should attend. You should be doing these things. So that's what being a professional is all about. So take responsibility for that. That's expected of you. just a nice summary here. A nice collaboration between student and supervisor usually recognises that you end up learning from each other. So while you go on this journey, this research journey, you're learning how to become a researcher, and your supervisor is guiding you and mentoring in that way. But your research actually may be something that your supervisor learns about. So you're creating this independent piece of work, and your supervisor is going to learn from that and probably get excited about it as well. So it's actually a really lovely collaboration when it works well. There's always, though, with any good collaboration, expectations. Like, make sure you agree what the expectations are. Get those authorship forms agreed. Make sure that there's a really coherent understanding of when you're meeting, who's meeting when, and what levels of support you're going to give each other. And finally, just be open and honest with your communication. If there's something not understood, you need to ask, and make sure you keep those meetings, keep rolling them over, and make sure that you keep documenting what's been agreed and what actions you'll be undertaking. So it really is a shared experience, and there's mutual responsibilities, and a lot of those responsibilities are outlined in the Australian Code, particularly in that supervision guide. So research misconduct isn't a topic that most students consider during their PhD. And after everything I've just told you, you probably think all researchers act with integrity all the time. So I guess my final goal of the session is to equip you with some knowledge if things do go wrong, and what kind of things do go wrong. So just want to share this high profile example of research misconduct. Diederik Stapel, he was a Dutch social psychologist, and he committed data fraud in 55 papers and in 10 PhD theses written by students he supervised. So that's a lot. There was also evidence of fraud, such as incorrectly reported numbers of participants in another 10 papers. Sometimes he fabricated entire experiments. Sometimes he manipulated data to show particular results, but he always collected the data himself. So that's where things get scary. When one person has access, one person's collecting data, there's no rigor, there's no honesty. He also handled a lot of all the raw data, including the raw data of the HDR students. So they weren't able to verify the results. But he was highly respected. He had a lot of funding and he had a good reputation. So people didn't really question it. But it started to get suspiciously perfect. So because it was so perfect, people did start to ask questions. And eventually he was found out. So I think the important things to take away from this example, though, are that it does happen. Sometimes people do act without integrity. Now, you can look him up and read more. He's actually made some statements about what he did and why. And they sometimes do act without integrity. It does just happen. But really what happened here, it wasn't just his choices. It was also the lack of questioning and the lack of transparency that led, like by his colleagues, by his peers, and by even the journals that he was publishing in. It was really difficult for somebody to question him. And really, it's basically sloppy science. It's really important to call out if there's an issue, call out that there's a problem. It really does take the whole community, and you can't just do a piece of research independently. It takes the whole community. Everyone needs to be able to verify things. It's important to be transparent and open. That community now includes you. You're a researcher as a PhD student as well. And interestingly, in this case, it was actually 3 of his PhD students who spoke up about their suspicions and demonstrated a commitment to research integrity. So that's how he ended up being found out, is actually through his HDR students who started to question where this data was coming from and how could it be so perfect. So yeah, an interesting story there. This is actually a UAW example. So this one is about a little bit about predatory publishers. So you might see here on the screen, I think I can get it up. There's this, this is understanding brain science can enhance leadership effectiveness. And it's by Harshman Marcus from the Department of Psychology and Management at the University of Wollongong in Wollongong, Australia. And this is in a journal called Entrepreneurship and Organisation Management. You can have a look, it's still up there. I am trying to get it down. I've been trying for over a year to get it down. Why am I trying to get it down? Well, first of all, Harshman Marcus is not a real person. Harshman Marcus does not exist. We've never had a Department of Psychology and Management at the University of Wollongong, so that also doesn't exist. So the entire thing is a fraud paper. Possibly written by some kind of generative AI tool, but this happens. What also happens is sometimes the author or one of the authors on a paper may be a real person. It could be you, for example. So it's really important to keep across what your author profile is being used for, like just by searching. But also just to be aware of what predatory practices are. You really, there is a library guide about this, and I think you can access this. I've provided a link on the screen, Strategic Publishing Guide. There are ways to find out what journals are predatory publishers or have really low or illegitimate standards. Some don't have peer review, for example. Some just charge you and they don't care what you publish. Some say they're going to do something and they don't, and others are creating like false science, basically. So just be aware that this is a practice that exists out there, and it's a it has been intensified by generative artificial intelligence. Not only are papers being generated, but whole author profiles are being generated as well. So also, when you're doing your research and looking for papers to back up your research, verify your sources, verify it's a legitimate paper, verify the author is a real person, and keep tabs on information that's being published about you. This is a cute little one too. Can you spot a concern? There's an image manipulation exercise here. So this one I've taken from the US. It's from the US Office of Research Integrity. That's the source for this one. So this is an interesting one. If you take a look, it depends on your background. You may or may not have seen something like this before if you're in more the sciences or the social sciences. On the left, you've got this comet assay control figure, and then you've got a protein A figure. And then in figure 4, you've got 7 different samples, a gel shift assay. Now, I don't know what this is. This is not my background, but I don't know what this is. But if we take a look at the left one, the comet one, what's actually happened here is that the control image has been cropped and relabeled as the image for protein A. It's also been lightened to make it appear as if the tails are actually longer than they should be. So it's basically image manipulation. It's research misconduct. So, and then with the one on the right, I don't know if you've spotted it yet. If you have a look at the 7 lanes, the 7 different tubes, 3 of them are the same. and they've been relabeled. So they've been copied and relabeled and reused to represent different experiments, but they've actually got the same result. So if you have a look at lane 3, lane 4, and lane 5, you can see that they're actually 3 of the same. So these are extreme examples, but the point is, practicing research integrity, you need to be able to trust research that you're basing your research on, but also be aware that these things happen. Where if you have images that you're putting into your works, into your theses, your images should be clearly and correctly representative of your results. Some minor, very minor image processing is acceptable, but there's a really fine line between enhancing an image to make it clearer and distorting it and telling a different story. So color enhancements, splicing, pasting, cropping, resizing, those kinds of things, they can be seen as manipulation. So if you do anything, be transparent, document all the changes that you make, retain the original images, and make sure you follow any guidelines that are spelt out in any journal that you might be publishing in or to your examiners. Okay. Okay. Now, so with Staple, the Diedrich Staple man, that hilarious predatory publishing example, and then those image manipulations experiences, I'd just like to share some like common misconceptions about how reporting concerns happens. So just some terminology before I get started and having a look at this spectrum of breaches. So a breach is defined, so a breach of research integrity is defined as a deviation from the principles and responsibilities in the code. Okay, so we've got a set of principles and responsibilities that we need to follow, and a breach is defined as a deviation from those. It can also be a deviation from a discipline standard or a policy, but it's a deviation. Now, before anything is assessed or or any investigation occurs, it's called a potential breach. So it's innocent until proven guilty kind of thing. So it's a breach before anybody takes a look at it. It's known as a potential breach. And then once they're reported, they're considered they're looked at, they're assessed, and they're investigated, and then they land on this scale somewhere. So they land somewhere between responsible conduct. They could be minor or less serious. So something that's minor or less serious could be, for example, say, for example, you accidentally shared the names of all participants with all participants. So, for example, you may send an email with all those participants on CC instead of BCC. Like that could be an accident, and it's understood that it's an accident. It's a very, very common one, and it's understood though. So it would be potentially considered to be minor or less serious, depending on depending on some more circumstances. You can then get into that major or more serious breach, and they're more in that orange zone. And then finally, you have research misconduct. So it's really important to see here that not all potential breaches end up turning into misconduct. So not everything is as severe as research misconduct. So it's often we find as well, it's better to report and address things that are minor or major so that they don't turn into misconduct. If we think back to that Diedrich Staple story, if we had have been able to report that earlier, before it got to 55 papers, maybe in the first paper, if the journal had have really questioned and said, I want to see the data and I want to check the data and how did you collect this data? If there was more rigor in the review process, then we may have not ended up leading to research misconduct. It might have got stopped earlier before so much damage was done. So really important that we understand that it's not every breach that we address ends up as misconduct. And sometimes it's better to address things as minor or major, or sometimes it's important to address small things before they become something like misconduct. There are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to reporting breaches, and this can lead to underreporting of concerns. I think we have underreporting of concerns at UAW. It's an issue because it could mean false or misleading information is entering the research record, basically, and it can cause harm to the greater community. So it's really important that we keep that scientific record correct and fix it. So some of the myths in relation to reporting concerns, it's everything from a lack of understanding that something needs to be reported to feeling there's no one there to ask, or that it only affects that person, thinking that only senior people report concerns, or that they're senior people and they couldn't possibly do any research misconduct. Maybe you think it's normal, maybe, or maybe you're worried about your future reputation. You may, if it's a concern that's got your name on it, or you raise a concern and it's not true, what would happen? So really, I think that these are misconceptions, and it's important that we start to have more open conversations and feel that anybody should feel like they can, report a concern or just speak up. So that's where our research integrity advisors come in. So when something does go wrong or you're not sure, we really encourage you to reach out. We have Dr. Jasmine over in Malaysia, but we also have a whole team of research integrity advisors. We have another one in Dubai, and we have another probably 14 or 15 here in Australia. And feel free to, if you don't want to talk to Jasmine, you can reach out to any of the research integrity advisors across UAW. And please don't be afraid to speak up and really sort of start to understand what might be a breach, or even you don't have to know, just ask the question. You don't have to report it. You can actually just talk it through with someone. Even myself, you can send me an email, or you can send a query through. Just say, is this right? Is this okay? We do have some resources available. If you do find yourself with a concern, we have some resources available to help you understand what would happen. And hopefully that encourages you to speak up. I have a little quiz here available to you. You're welcome. There's 10 questions. All responses are anonymous. If you'd like to use your mobile phones to scan that, you're more than welcome. You can scan that QR code, or you can just use the form link at the bottom. This really, I'll see the responses, but there's no names associated with any of it. This really helps me, it helps you to see how much you've understood from today's session. So there's 10 questions about general things that I've spoken about today. But it also helps me to understand where I might need to spend more time, or where I might need to talk about things or make things clearer. So it would be great if all of you could run through that quiz, but you don't have to. Hopefully there's no problems with you accessing that. It is on the UAW network, but I've made it open to the whole world. So hopefully it works okay. But I'd love for you to do that. Lastly, this will be circulated to you. This I see this document as really, now that you've got a bit more of an idea of what is expected of you and what to expect in a supervisory collaboration, and what your responsibilities are. This is a little checklist. You don't have to work through this in the next day or week or anything like that, but it's something that you can have even as part of your meetings, and you can work through together. You can keep it in the background there and see if you want to include it in your project plan and that kind of thing. I really encourage you to, read through the code, be aware of the code, be aware that there are resources and things to help you. And yeah, there's a number of different professional workshops that are available, and there's a lot of training that's available as well. We expect research integrity training to become mandatory, possibly by the end of the year, and that will involve completing the online research integrity training. That's the third one from the bottom there. It's a series of 8 modules. It's probably 4 hours total. Probably for a PhD student, it would probably take 4 hours. Potentially after coming to this, you might be able to go through the content a little quicker, and you get a certificate at the end. So it would be really good if you could start working your way through that online research integrity training. It would be great if you could start working your way through that. And as part of your annual progress reviews, you're asked about research integrity training. So as part of the annual progress reviews that you usually would have every year to review your progress in your PhD, you would have this, you can say that you've attended some research integrity training here with me. And if you were to complete that online training, you can include that certificate there as well. There's also questions in there related to data management. So if there was data management training that you undertook, you could include that in there as well. So this training counts. And I guess some final little thoughts from me. Research integrity, I said this at the beginning, it is a large and very broad topic. I think you'll gather from today that I've talked about a whole range of different things. You, particularly the PhD candidates on the call today, you're not expected to know all the answers today and at the start of your research, but as you go on your research journey, I do want you to stop and have a think about those principles and think, is this okay? Is what I'm doing honest, rigorous? Am I being transparent? Am I acting with fairness? Have I thought about respect for participants and animals? Am I demonstrating accountability here? And for the supervisors, am I promoting research integrity in my meetings with my students? So, research integrity, ultimately, it's not optional. It applies to every decision in the research process. And it's really about doing the right thing, sometimes even when nobody's watching. So finally, a little quote from Bren Brown. So arm yourself with knowledge to know what's right, and please don't take shortcuts. Please take the time to stop and verify and continue to practice good values, really, rather than just talking about them, which is what I'm doing today. Research integrity, ultimately, it provides or creates a safe, respectful research environment, enhances that impact, the overall impact and quality of research, and it contributes to just a positive reputation for the research community, which all you PhD candidates, you are now part of that research community. So that is it from me. There's my contact details. I've also included some internal references, external references, and some interesting literature about why research integrity matters. If you're interested, these are recent documents. I find them interesting. And that is it from me. So I'm going to stop sharing and I will go to the questions in the chat. All right. Where are we up to? I've got Thank you. How do honesty and openness differ? So that's a good question, Dr. Lowe. How do honesty and openness differ? So I think with openness, we're talking a lot about open access. So we're talking about making sure we potentially, like, we publish everything that, like the data, the methodology, and your research outputs, of course, rather than having them, say, behind a paywall and only available to certain people. That's what we're talking about with openness. Honesty is more about the process that we use in the background to create the research. So honesty is a lot about the making honest decisions as we go along. And it's a lot about not fabricating or falsifying results. Okay, how do we navigate around the conflict between sharing openly and protecting privacy? So protecting privacy will always come first, okay? But what we can do to protect the privacy of participants, if you can make things completely de-identified, there's possibly a subset of information that could be shared openly. Alternatively, you've got a research data management plan, and which contains your metadata. So you don't have to publish sensitive human data, but you could publish metadata. So you could publish information about where your data is stored, like as in it would be stored behind something very secure, who to contact to ask questions. You can publish what the access restrictions are, why those access restrictions are in place. You could publish when you collected the data, the methodology for collecting the data. So there are things that you can publish about whilst also protecting the privacy of participants. I hope that helps answer that question. How about an educator pursues her PhD at the same uni with the same faculty? Is there any issue pertaining conflict of interest? An educator. So that, I think you're saying you work in the faculty and you are potentially lecturing, a lecturer in the faculty, and also creating their PhD. This happens quite often. And I don't think, I think it's really important to, anytime you're doing a piece of work, ask yourself, is this piece of work related to my PhD, or is this piece of work related to my job or my employment here? And think about, usually here at UAW in Australia, it's actually a different log-on as well. So you log in with a different username. So you need to think about that a little bit. So there's some practical sides to that, but also it comes down probably to the supervisors. You probably need to check, make sure that your supervisors are aware of the course, that you are actually employed at the university as well as a student at the university. So being transparent across the faculty about the fact that both these things are happening. There may be times where, if a HDR issue or concern is being discussed at a faculty level, that you may need to sit that out because you're actually a student as well. I hope that answers that. If there is a particular concern that you'd like to talk about, I'm happy for you to email it through to me, and I can look at it in a little bit more detail to work out how I could give advice on how you could manage that conflict of interest. But I think it's all possible. It happens here a lot in Australia, that somebody is employed as well as doing their PhD and they're in the same faculty. That's fine. Okay, was there any other questions today? No. Well, thank you all for listening to me. I know it's a very long time to listen, but I really appreciate all of you joining today. And I will get those resources off and have them distributed to everybody. So thank you.
A big thank you to our speaker, Ms. Ryah, for sharing her expertise and insight with us today. Thank you for all for attending today's session. We hope you found the information valuable and that will help you in a future research journey. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you. Okay, am I okay to leave? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
right. Bye. Have a nice day.
You too.